Hello all, thanks for joining and welcome to the third webinar in this series hosted by CLASP and RAP, where we look at different regional heat pump adoption efforts throughout the US. This webinar builds on CLASP and RAP's paper titled Accelerating Heat Pump Adoption Through the Inflation Reduction Act and Complementary Policies. So this paper looks at federal funding and the role of supporting state energy policies. As I said, this is our third webinar where we now turn our focus to the Mountain West region of the US. Just briefly, I want to address that we understand there are a lot of questions and uncertainty about the status of federal funding for programs supporting building electrification and heat pump adoption. At this point, there's a lot of speculation and not as many clear answers about the future of and the current state of federal funding. So, as we did in our paper today, we intend to focus on state and local policies that support heat pump adoption. There are many fascinating and really important programs and policies in the Mountain West. With today's webinar, we are going to take a deeper dive into some of these programs with our guest panelists. We will be talking about states in the Mountain West and having a conversation with Devin Filicicchia, an electrification specialist with the Community Development Division for the city of Missoula, Montana. Next, we'll be speaking with Maren Mahoney, the director for the Arizona Office of Resiliency. And finally, Neil Kolwey, an industrial program director and building electrification specialist at SWEEP. So a few quick notes about this webinar. This session will be recorded. Please note that webinar attendees are automatically muted when they join. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A pane. Following the panelist discussions, we will have time for questions for our panelists. We will pause recording at the top of the hour, but our panelists have agreed to stop and stay on for a few minutes after the official webinar end time to address any additional questions. Welcome now to Devin, who will be having a conversation with Raphael Breit.
Thanks, Vivian, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Devin, for joining us today. This is our third webinar in this series, and to date, we've spoken with people who have been involved in heat pump adoption efforts, mostly at the state level. And Devin, you're the first person we've spoken with whose work really focuses at the local, state, and county level. So with that, I want to just open up by asking you to walk us through your programs. What's it like running heat pump adoption programs at the state and county level in Missoula?
Sure. Thanks so much, Raphi. There's a few key programs I really want to talk about, but I want to start off just by acknowledging that it's a pretty small program. So me personally, my title's Electrification Specialist, but my work is really split half between building efficiency and electrification work. The other half focuses on transportation. So yeah, this is really half of my workload, but do have a lot of great partners, both at the county and a local nonprofit that we work really closely with. The first program I want to talk about is kind of our umbrella of all of this work, and it's called our Electrify Missoula program. This is really a joint effort, so it's kind of a collaboration between the city, the county, and the county of Missoula, just because that can get a little confusing, and also a local nonprofit, Climate Smart Missoula, since we have all adopted the same climate goals. So this way we kind of wanted to streamline the process, make sure that folks who are looking for electrification resources can go to the same place and won't get confused by our city site being different from the counties and so on. Yeah, kind of has the three goals of reducing emissions, improving health, and saving energy. And like I mentioned, it's just kind of our landing page for all things electrification. So we want to direct kind of everyone there. And I think it helps a lot with the bureaucracy of government. For example, it's so much easier to update this shared website that's kind of managed by our nonprofit partner instead of having to go through all the processes of updating our own city site. And ultimately, it's mostly an education program. So we host a lot of events. We'll tell electrification stories and connect people to a lot of funding opportunities that we're finding to be kind of confusing for the average person. So that's kind of the umbrella of all this work, the Electrify Missoula program. And yeah, I think that's a helpful overview, but I'm glad to talk a little bit more about that. But I think one of the key pieces of that really relate to heat pumps is that we administer a joint city and county heat pump water heater rebate. So that's available for everyone in county limits. It's funded by the State Department of Environmental Quality. And what it looks like is a $500 rebate and a $75 addition if folks complete a follow-up survey. So that follow-up survey has been really instrumental in kind of helping us understand where adoption's at and kind of the challenges that we face specifically related to heat pump water heaters. I'm really proud that our requirements are very minimal. It's pretty much the only requirement is that it has to be a residential heat pump water heater. So it makes it a lot easier than our utility rebates, for example, and kind of navigating things like tax rebates. And yeah, so there's other local rebates that provide more money, but I think in general, they're a little bit less accessible. Ours, for example, we don't care if you're sticking with the same fuel source or fuel switching. Really, anyone who could use a heat pump water heater, we want to get this rebate out to. We've approved 40 rebates so far. 35 of those have been distributed as of today. But we still have funds to distribute a good bit more, maybe 29 or so. So we would have loved to have run out of rebates really fast, but I do think that this program has been helpful for us to understand our local market. Yeah, and I can chat in a minute about some of our survey findings and things like that. But yeah, I think our heat pump water heater rebate program is a big component of all that. And I also just want to acknowledge that there are some pretty state and region specific pieces of context when thinking about heat pumps and electrification and all those things. I think two limiting measures from the state legislature is that we can't have a carbon penalty. So there's a carbon penalty prohibition. So that's certainly not a policy we're looking towards. And another one is that we don't have an ability to limit certain fuels in building codes. So that results in us not being able to require all new buildings to be all electric or something similar. And in general, I think, we face a lot of, probably like every other cold climate state, we face a lot of heat pump misconceptions. Hear a lot of times that heat pumps don't work in cold climates. And ultimately, I think that's why we targeted heat pump water heater rebates, just because it kind of removes that barrier. And yeah, I think the idea of backup heat can be frightening to folks at times. And another piece is just our natural gas rates are pretty affordable, whereas our electricity through our local investor-owned utility is a little bit more expensive. But I think that's a good overview of kind of all of our programs. And yeah, glad to chat more about any of them or any other specific pieces.
Thank you. There's an awful lot of information for what you term to be kind of a smaller program. There's a lot to dive into here. I think I want to start by just asking you a little bit more about what your experience has been like reaching out to potential customers. Are these rebates only for people within the city or the county of Missoula, or are other people in the, in surrounding counties maybe eligible if they're interested? And how do you go about trying to connect with potential customers for these rebates?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really good question. So the heat pump water heater rebate that we administer, that is just for City of Missoula residents and Missoula County residents. So that has a geographic kind of limitation, but our Electrify Missoula website as a whole, we do try to point kind of our other folks in other similar regions to ours towards that website, just because it does have some resources that may provide a little bit more of a local context for things like IRA funding and other rebates that are available. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about how the Electrify Missoula process kind of works. We've talked a little about how the rebates are structured, and you mentioned that the rebates are funded with money coming from the state. But how is Electrify Missoula structured? You've got the city, you've got the county of Missoula, and you have the Climate Smart nonprofit. How does the funding situation work between the three of those, and how does that affect how the program is run?
Yeah, it's truly just a pooling of resources and financial resources there to support the program. So I think that helps a lot. If it was just the city trying to hold up something like this, I don't think we'd be very successful because we wouldn't have much funds to allocate towards it. But I think kind of pooling our resources has been helpful. And also, I think it really helps us kind of leverage the skills or assets that each team has individually. Like, for example, on the city side, none of us really have much like graphic design experience. And our partners at Climate Smart Missoula, we have someone who, their background's in communications and graphic design. So I think really it wouldn't be a program without this collaboration. And yeah, I think that kind of this united front also is helpful for folks kind of realizing that like this isn't some one-off goal that just comes from a climate focused nonprofit or something. It's something where both the city and the county are on board as well.
That's really impressive. We've talked to a number of people, like I said at the top of this discussion, and one of the common themes that we've consistently heard is that this need for collaboration, working together, kind of aligning goals, what be it at the state level, local level, or even between states, and how if different organizations, regulators, all these kinds of actors can come together, you very often see much more outsized impact. And it sounds like you're really making the most of the resources that you have here, which again is very impressive to me. Do you get any kind of funding or support from the state, or are you doing it all yourselves?
Yeah, the state DEQ's been a helpful tool, but I think that really is passed down in kind of smaller grants and more individual projects. But yeah, I think, it is what makes that heat pump water heater rebate, for example, happen. So really been a helpful tool.
Thanks. And I think we have be time for one more question before, unfortunately, we're going to have to move it along. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on the carbon penalty prohibition, how that works, and maybe more in general, just what your relationship is with the state and state regulations and how those writ large affect the work that you're trying to do, or are there other regulators or other organizations or nonprofits elsewhere in the state that you work with? Just kind of throw it back to you to talk a little bit about your relationship with the state at large.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just to reiterate, the state has a carbon penalty prohibition, so we can't. I think if I'm remembering correctly, an example of this was like we tried to pass a local gas tax and couldn't do that because it's seen as a carbon penalty prohibition or seen as a carbon penalty. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, and especially on the city level. Like I don't think that if we could have some carbon penalties in place, I don't know if we would do that tomorrow. But I do think it does kind of yeah, I think it informs our relationship a little bit. I think what really affects my work a little bit more is like the lack of ability to limit certain fuels in building codes, just because, I think if we could one day institute something like requiring all new buildings or all certain types of buildings to be all electric, we probably wouldn't do that now, but we'd probably have some stretch codes in place that can prepare the community for that and get us to a closer place. And because of that lack of local power, the stretch code would be little more than like a recommendation. So we don't know if there'd be much movement because of that. So I think it's challenging, but I think the flip side of the coin is it really helps us really be creative and lean into incentive programs and other ways that we can kind of build momentum with heat pump work and electrification work, because of these two like limiting measures from the state legislature, we're ultimately trying to build something that like can hit the triple bottom line without any mandates or any things imposed relating to building codes or similar. So I think that it's right now it's a challenge, but I'm hoping that it can create a really sustainable program as we prove over and over again that like not only are these things like good technologies, but they can save you money, and they work really well and they're efficient, and so it's not all bad is I guess what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I certainly appreciate your positive outlook on the challenges and the relationship with the state at large, and I do hope that you're able to get through to as many people as possible in Missoula and get the word out about the effectiveness and the benefits that come with heat pumps. And with that, I think it's time to pass it off to my colleague, Dave Farnsworth, who is going to speak with Maren Mahoney as our next conversation. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks, Rafi, and thanks, Devin. That was a great conversation. Well, Maren, welcome. Nice to see you, and I'm glad you could join us today. But before we start talking about your program, I'd like to talk sort of about the context a little bit. When we talk about heat pumps, many parts of the country, as the name implies, we're talking about heating. But in your part of the West, especially parts of Arizona where you live, Maricopa County, Phoenix, we're talking about cooling. And I wonder if you could just discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, it's great to be here today. Thanks for having me. You're right. So Arizona, Phoenix, the Phoenix metro area in particular has a unique relationship to heat pumps. We really rely on them mostly for cooling, although it is a little cooler here, and I did turn on our heat pump for heat the other day. So it does happen here in Phoenix. But mostly they're used for cooling. So we're seeing hotter, longer heat seasons. We actually don't really call them summers anymore in parts of our state. Unfortunately, in 2023, we saw 645 people die from heat-related causes just here in Maricopa County. That did not account for all of the statewide deaths. And that was a 52% increase from 2022. And at that time, the summer, the heat season was record-breaking until last summer of 2024, which is when we had 113 days over 100 degrees. And we've been just at the state level, we have started having these conversations about the deadliness of heat, the economic impacts of heat on our economy, and the public health impacts, and how do we rise to the moment and address this issue, which is really a disaster that is kind of, it's complex and it's a bit slower moving than a hurricane or a flood, but it is truly a disaster that requires that kind of response. I'll go back a little bit to the first summer that my boss was in office, which was 2023. Governor Hobbs had her first summer in office, and that, as I mentioned, we were seeing record-breaking heat, not only the minimum and maximum temperatures, but the duration was longer than we had seen previously. So Governor Hobbs issued an emergency declaration, and then we also developed an executive order that she signed to address heat preparedness and response and better coordinate on this. And at that time, there was the EO directed me in my position as the director of the Office of Resiliency to lead a statewide development of a statewide plan for extreme heat preparedness. And ultimately, what we came up with was a number of interventions that both nearer term and longer term that were recommended for improvements in the topic areas of housing, energy, and emergency response. A couple of other things that came out of this plan, like more specific recommendations, was the establishment of a chief heat officer position to help implement the plan. And then we developed some cooltainers, because in our state we've developed some centers where you can go for if you have cooling needs. Let's say your air conditioner is broken and you need a place to go to cool off and make sure that your body does not overheat. There are so we developed some cooltainers to distribute throughout the state. And then we also identified what programs can we use from my office to also address this issue at the residential and the building level. So that also, like at that time, we had applied for and received our $76 million grant from the Department of Energy to develop this home energy appliance rebate program. So there was no heat pump program at the state level until we received this award. And we've been busy standing that up. And as we were developing that program from scratch, we decided to launch it as a tailored program and focus on heat pumps for AC replacement. And it really made sense because addressing heat impacts to elderly children in their homes was very much needed, and it made a lot of sense for this program to really focus on that issue. We also saw that summer that a local nonprofit had created a $3 million fund for AC replacement that was drawn down extremely quickly. So just the timeliness of this program was important. And I'll also mention that in a previous position of mine, I had met with CLASP and RIP a few times to discuss this idea of heat pumps for cooling and where that might work in terms of a policy stance. So this kind of was already in my head, the seed had been planted from those conversations. Luckily, also Arizona already has a kind of a good environment when it comes to heat pump adoption. Of course, the actual environment is more favorable. We have a pretty efficient, we have a mild climate in terms of cold weather, and so therefore increases the efficiency. And we've got a workforce, an HVAC workforce that's fairly comfortable with heat pump installation, which is also really important for that kind of adoption. So, and then our understanding is that broadly about 30% of residential buildings already have heat pumps. But we're finding also that in some places the penetration is actually higher. We're getting a lot of applications for our rebate program where we actually have to tell people that unfortunately they are ineligible because it would be a heat pump replacement, in which we are unable to do. And then I'm just going to tell a brief story. When we were standing up this program also, we did hear from a number of individuals who were asking about this rebate program. There's a woman named Mary, for instance. She's an older woman. She was taking care of her disabled daughter and grandchildren. She said their AC had been broken for over a year, and a pet of theirs had died because of the heat. And was there anything that we could do? And so these kinds of stories we were hearing also impacted the development of this program. Our program accepts applications through efficiencyarizona.com, and we're continuing to build out the fuller rebate program now, but we continue to focus on that AC replacement with heat pumps.
Wow, that's terrific. That's some stunning news as well. I hadn't appreciated the public health basis for what you're doing. You mentioned the efficiency program in your state. Can you talk about how that works, how utilities might be involved with this? Are they coordinating, and are other efficiency programs supporting this work?
Yes, we are definitely partnering with our utilities. Our utilities have their own efficiency programs, of course, and they do have some rebates on a much smaller scale than ours. Ours goes up to $14,000 depending on income eligibility and other requirements. But we meet regularly with the utilities. They're also helping with data, data sharing, and we're also trying to find our way where we all are working together and stacking these rebates and any other support for heat pump adoption, so that we're maximizing that impact for families and households. We're also working with local communities to get the word out. We've got City of Flagstaff and Phoenix and Pinal County, up and down the state, have their own weatherization and their own efficiency programs, and we're having conversations with them. How do we find out? How do we, make sure that we're all not necessarily cannibalizing, but we're all each other's programs, where we're actually just adding value and stacking that value together? And also, how can we build out our qualified contractor networks? And so those conversations are happening with those community at the community level as well. And then tribal, we have 22 federally recognized tribes here, and that's very important that we're working closely with those governments to make sure that that our program is reaching into those communities, and people are being able to take advantage of it on the different tribal lands.
So Rafi referred to these other webinars and contacts we've had with other folks rolling out heat pump programs around the country. And the situation is almost an embarrassment of riches. In other words, there's so much out there. Consequently, it's confusing to the consumer. And it sounds like you're undertaking efforts to coordinate things and endeavoring to stack up benefits so people don't run afoul by signing on to one program, run afoul of maybe taking advantage of another program. That coordination sounds like it's a really important step.
Yeah, and another tool that we've developed, thanks to the group RMI, we worked with them to develop a clean energy hub. So now if you're a business, if you're a nonprofit, if you are an individual, you can go on to this clean energy hub and find out, and you can put in just a few different data points, just your zip code and what utility territory you're in, and a few other data points, and it'll tell you what you're eligible for. So like you said, David, this is incredibly confusing. And, if you're an individual, or you're a small business owner, and you're looking to save money, and you're like, I don't know where to go to. We're hoping that this is a one-stop shop where you can go and you can identify, oh, I could stack that with that and take advantage of that, and then really price out what the technology would ultimately be for, to help people with that kind of coordination and that information transparency.
That sounds really valuable. So just one last question. You're talking about one of your rebates as high as $14,000. It's my understanding that low and moderate income households just don't have the economic wherewithal or the flexibility to make this change, these sort of changes that you're describing. It sounds like those rebates are focused on those sort of customers. Is that sort of thing available? If that's correct, is that sort of thing available around the state? Because I was thinking, well, Flagstaff gets cold. There may be similar needs for heat pump technology to not cool as much as maybe the case in Phoenix, but to heat things as well.
Yes, this is a statewide program, and that's why we're working with the local communities, because Maricopa County, Phoenix kind of gets all the attention in Arizona, but we've got a lot of communities in need throughout the state. It gets very cold up in northern Arizona, but it's also getting hotter and hotter. So this is a technology that can address all of those issues throughout the state. There is something that we're still investigating, because there is going to be that price gap, right? There is the technology itself can be kind of costly, and potentially if you're a very low income, you might not be able to afford that entire. And so we are investigating. I don't have an answer yet as to how to address that gap, but we are investigating that, because it is really important that we are able to get these into people's homes because of that public health aspect.
So that wasn't the last question. This is going to be the last question for you. Are utility regulators involved in these discussions? And what sort of assistance have you considered that they might help you with to make this make these programs roll out even more effectively?
We haven't really had very in-depth conversations with our regulators. We here in Arizona, we've kind of have a unique configuration. They're a separate branch. While I think it's they're welcoming and supportive in general. What we're doing is working with our utility partners, because then they can bring that package to the if there are any additional programs that they wanted to receive approval for, then we're working with our utility partners on it rather than our commissioners at this point.
Understood. Well, that's great. It's really impressive. Thanks so much for being with us, and stick around. I'm sure there are more questions that are going to come in. We're going to pivot. We're going to talk with Neil Kolwey from SWEEP. Hi, Neil. Glad you could join us today.
Hi, Dave. Thanks. Good to be here.
So you've been studying heat pump deployment in that part of the country for quite a while, and when you and I chatted, we thought we would talk about two states specifically, and the first one we decided we would talk with is Colorado. Can you discuss the different utility programs that are occurring there, and how heat pump adoption is rolling out?
Yeah. Do you want to go to the next slide since we're talking about Colorado? There you go. Well, let's talk about Xcel Energy, which is the largest investor-owned utility. And because of that, they're also very regulated. And then also I showed some numbers here for the tri-state co-ops, which, let's just say for simplicity, they cover most of the rest of the state that Xcel Energy does not cover. So you can see we've had some success. They've basically like tripled their numbers of heat pumps rebated over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think some of the factors are, first of all, offering significant rebates is really important and helpful. And another element is training the contractors. Both the previous speakers talked a little bit about how it's a little challenging for some contractors in the colder climates, which most of Colorado is climate zone 5 or higher, which means a design heating temperature of like around 0 degrees in Denver. And so a few years ago, let's say, a lot of contractors still had the misconceptions that, well, heat pumps don't work very well, and what are we going to do? You're better off putting in a furnace and stuff like that. But now I think we're a few years beyond that, and Xcel and Tri-State both have lists of qualified contractors. They require them to go through some training, and I think we've made a lot of progress in overcoming some of those misconceptions. Also, I know you want to ask me about policies, and so I want to just mention that the state legislation clarified for Xcel a few years ago that they're allowed to do fuel switching and promote electric heat pumps in place of gas heating. That's no problem. And furthermore, they basically said, we want you to provide incentives for that and develop a special beneficial electrification plan. And now that's part of the overall energy efficiency plan for Xcel and Black Hills is the beneficial electrification part. I'm going to pause and see if you want to ask me something else so that I don't just keep rambling.
You're not rambling at all. No, this is very interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about the workforce education? Because we've seen different models of that around the country, some looser than others. And it'd be interesting to know, is there still a shortage of qualified installers, or does the state feel like they're meeting those needs?
Well, I think it's kind of hit and miss depending on which part of the state. Like I'm sure in some of the rural areas, you might have a hard time finding a good heat pump installer. But in the main parts of the state and those covered by Excel, I think that's really changing. And one of the things that Excel did, which was really helpful, is they basically said, if you want to offer our rebates, you have to go to our training. And they provide like a 1.5 day training. I think it started out that way, and I think now you don't. And I think they say, you know, you, Mr. Contractor, you have to send at least one of your people to this training once a year. And it's free, but you still have to send somebody and they have to attend the whole thing. And then if you do, then you can be listed on their qualified contractor list and you can give the rebates. Tri-States is a little more loose, like you said, a lot of utilities, it's a lot looser. They offer a training, they recommend that you do it. It was started during the pandemic, so it was like a 2-hour online thing, or maybe it was 2 sessions of 2 hours, I forgot. But they didn't have a requirement that you had to do it. It was just like highly recommended, and then if you do, you get to be on their list, but there's no requirement that if you're not on the list, you can't give their rebate. So I've seen variations of among utilities of those kinds of requirements. So I think the more trainings you offer and the more utilities that require it or highly encourage it, then you do build up that expertise. And I'm involved with a coalition of all the utilities in Colorado called the Beneficial Electrification League of Colorado. And we promote sharing of ideas about training and letting contractors know about other trainings coming up, and also including heat pump water heater installations in addition to heat pumps. So yeah, so that's what we have for now.
That's great. That's really helpful. In our discussions ahead of this webinar, you described Colorado as having a lot of financial support for heat pump adoption. A clean heat standard is one of the things that Colorado has, for example. That's one of the policies that we explore in our paper. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that's helping in driving adoption?
Yeah. When it was proposed a few years ago, I thought, oh my God, this is never going to pass. That's pretty outrageous, requiring all the investor-owned gas utilities, of which there are 6 in Colorado, and Xcel Energy is the largest gas utility as well as the largest electric investor-owned. But it requires all the gas utilities to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from their sales to residential and commercial customers by 20% by 2030. So it's basically saying, we don't care how you do it, but you're going to have to sell less of your product over the next, 8 years. Let's say it was passed in 2022. And so what it has resulted in for Xcel Energy, for example, is because they are in most areas, they offer both gas and electric service, and some places they only do the gas and some places only electric, so it's a little complicated, but they are basically like tripling their rebates for heat pumps because of the clean heat goals. And so, for example, last year, I think their rebate for like a Energy Star not cold climate heat pump, which you would normally install with a backup furnace, that their rebate for that was around $1,500. And now the rebate is, I think it's up to $1,200 per cooling ton. And so if you're offering, so if it's a 3-ton system, that's $3,600. So that's quite a bit more. And if it's for a cold climate heat pump, now the new rebate is $2,200, $2,150 actually, per heating ton, and that's complicated. I wouldn't recommend writing the rebate that way, but and so if it's a 4-ton cold climate system, that's like almost $8,800 in rebate from Excel. And so that's a remarkable increase, and should result in a lot more heat pump adoption, especially cold climate ones.
Well, I take your point that when you first saw this legislation, you were thinking it would never pass because it potentially cuts into the business of these gas companies. And this program, it sort of works like a renewables portfolio standard for electric companies. You're required to provide a certain type of resource. And in this case, it's just a carbon-free resource. In the long term, do you think this is going to help gas companies morph or change from being commodity suppliers to being, clean heat suppliers? That's a term I've heard used, where they not only provide gas and support for the equipment that people have to burn gas, but also provide these other technologies and the support for adopting those.
Well, that's a great question, and you're probably familiar with what's going on in Vermont, and we're not supposed to talk about that, but they've certainly been a leader with Vermont Gas having the ability to do what you just said. And I think there are not that many examples around the country of gas utilities really taking that on and saying, hey, can we get permission to earn a profit by selling heat pumps rather than selling more gas? But it's certainly possible, and maybe that's the next wave. And when we move on to Utah, we can talk about what Dominion Energy did, if you want to go there, or if do you want to talk about?
Let's do.
All right.
No, let's continue on to Utah right now. I think we need another slide.
Can we go to the next slide? In Utah, there was a unique partnership between Rocky Mountain Power, the largest electric utility, and Dominion Energy, the largest gas utility. And they both provide pretty substantial rebates for heat pumps. And so customers can take advantage of both and basically double their rebate. And if I remember, let's say it's $1,500 from each utility. So the customer could get like $3,000, which is way higher than most normal utilities offer individually. And so the reason that Dominion wanted to do this was, first of all, they already had revenue decoupling, meaning they earn just as much money if they sell a little less gas. And so the leaders in Utah of the company were interested in doing this. They saw an interest from their customers. They thought, we can make a lot of customers happy if we do this. We're not going to lose any money. And so they were able to convince the upper management in Virginia that they should go ahead and do this. And then they worked with Rocky Mountain Power and aligned their rebate requirements. And it's been a very successful program. You can see the numbers on the left, and they're kind of double counting. It's probably the same, like, overall, let's say 3,000 heat pumps installed in 2023, and probably got most of those, as you can see from the numbers, most of those got rebates from both the gas company and the utility and the electric utility. So that's pretty interesting. And then just to talk about the fuel switching thing for a minute, it was also important that Rocky Mountain Power got the blessing from the state legislation. They proposed and were able to get passed just a simple few words in the statute that says Rocky Mountain Power is allowed to promote heat pumps. It can be part of their normal DSM plan, electric energy efficiency plan. And so now Rocky Mountain Power is happy to promote heat pumps. And like I said, Dominion is happily promoting heat pumps too. It's pretty interesting. And one thing, just to say something about dual fuel heat pumps, it makes sense in climate zone 5, which is basically what they are in like Salt Lake City and surrounding. And what their requirement is that if your existing furnace is already efficient and they have certain requirements, like it has to have at least the ECM motor, and it has to be reasonably well matched so that it can communicate with the new heat pump. If you have that, you don't necessarily have to buy a new furnace. And if you don't, then you do have to buy a new furnace. So then you buy a new furnace and a new heat pump. The new furnace is relatively cheap compared to the heat pump. And then you could run you run the furnace for temperatures below 25 or 30, and you run the heat pump for temperatures above that. And it's a very efficient system, and it's cheaper to install for a retrofit than putting in a cold climate heat pump, unless you have massive incentives for the cold climate heat pump, like I mentioned that XL is offering now.
That's really interesting. Just with maybe a minute left, can you talk about the ICAST program and multifamily housing? Because that's another, single family housing is a challenge, but multifamily housing is a much bigger challenge.
Yeah, this is a really interesting program, and I think we give a lot of credit to ICAST for their I don't know, ingenuity or coming up with this. They took advantage of the custom rebates from Rocky Mountain Power, and they're the implementer of Rocky Mountain Power's program serving multifamily housing. A lot of them are low income as well. And what they do is they go in and they try to do a deep retrofit and do as much as they can at one time, including efficiency improvements and putting in heat pumps. And a lot of their retrofits were in multifamily buildings that had electric resistance heating. So then you definitely get energy savings and cost savings by replacing electric resistance heating with heat pumps. And then in more recent years, I think they've also been able to do some where they replaced old gas boiler systems with heat pumps, and they like to put in mini splits in each individual unit. So if anybody wants to learn more, you can read the case study that we wrote here. And like I said, I think ICAST has just done a great job in putting this program together and delivering a lot of successes. It's kind of, you're right, it is challenging to serve the multifamily market, and this is a pretty cool example.
Great, Neil. Well, you've just brought up all sorts of really interesting things. Fuel switching, highly progressive sort of policy. Surprised to see we're seeing heat pumps used in cold temperatures where oftentimes people say that can't be done. And to see this rolling out for multifamily housing is also very encouraging, because that's a tough policy nut to crack. Well, thank you so much for this, both Maren and Neil. And I'm going to hand off to Vivian, who's got more questions.
Thank you again to all of our panelists. I think we have a couple of questions that have already had typed responses in the Q&A, and I'm going to kick us off with a few questions for Neil, if that's all right. First from Sandy, in Colorado, has there been heat pump price inflation from the incentives?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people think that that's true. And I know I've been following what are the prices of heat pumps over the last 3 years, let's say, and they definitely have gone up. And maybe some of that is because what Sandy is suspecting here, that if the contractor knows he's going to get a $2,000 rebate to give to the customer, that maybe he can charge more. So yeah, that's probably happening to some extent. And you would take a master's thesis or something for people to figure out, well, how much of it is the contractor gouging the prices, and how much of it is just normal inflation of the equipment costs and labor costs and everything else. So I don't know.
Thanks, Neil. We have another question for you from Jim. Can the Colorado gas utilities use renewable gas or hydrogen injections to meet the 20% standard? Are they?
They are allowed to use a certain, I forget how it's worded, but there's a certain restriction on how much of the goal you can hit with those alternative fuels. And most of the advocates like SWEEP, try to argue that that's not the best way. It's not the most cost-effective way. There's not enough renewable gas. Using hydrogen for this is really inefficient and expensive and not wise. But some of the gas utilities are proposing to use some of those things, yes.
All right, Neil, I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to switch to a question for Maren and Devin. So for this one from Ken, workforce needs, are there established statistics such as person hours per installation that can be used to determine the number of heat pump installers required in order to meet policy objectives? A complex question for you.
I think that's another great master's thesis project right there. I mean, no, nobody is collecting person hours per installation and trying to do that kind of math. I mean, that's an interesting question. I suppose you could do that, but I'm not aware of anything like that.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm going to turn now to a couple other questions that I have. So for Maren, you spoke about a hub where programs for incentives and rebates are listed. Individuals can go and type in their zip code or other pieces of information to find relevant rebates for them. Was just wondering if you could clarify if utilities contribute. I know that there sometimes are smaller rebates, but if utilities contribute to this website content, are they involved in the Clean Energy Hub?
We collected all of the rebates available. So yes, if your utility provides a rebate, my utility provides a $200 rebate actually for a heat pump, and so that will come up as well as you might be eligible for Efficiency Arizona, as well as an EV tax credit, as well as blah blah blah. So it's federal, it's local, it's utility, it's state, everything you might be eligible for, given the data points that you've provided, it comes up on that site. And I can drop the link. Vivian, does it help if I just send it to you and then you share it, or what's the best?
Yeah, that would be great. We can, if you drop it in the chat, we can share it with the attendees. That would be great. Thank you, Maren.
Yes.
That's such a great resource. I wish more states were doing something like that. So thank you for that. For Devin, so you spoke about some of the local rebates that you guys have distributed so far. I think you said something like 35 out of 40 approved rebates. So this sounds like a relatively small program, and you said you have funds for maybe another 29 or so. Are there plans in the future to expand this or to keep this going, or was this kind of a pilot effort? I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was certainly a pilot effort, and I believe our contract is actually up on the 31st of this month, but we have plans to expend the rest of the funds. We still haven't decided exactly what we're going to do with those. Our first thought is just extending the heat pump water heater rebate to kind of bridge the gap between now and when the Here and Her programs are live in Montana. So that's probably going to be a priority of the rest of the funds. And then I think the rest of it is just like creative solutions to help address why we've only distributed a little more than half of the rebates. So we may invest some in some like Google ads or other things like that, really just to get the word out. Because I think what we've been finding kind of anecdotally is just a lot of folks are unaware of this. And I get it that heat pump water heaters in particular aren't necessarily the most fun thing to talk about every evening, like with your friends. But I think we're trying to, kind of push it a little bit more, just because, like, I think related to my response to Sandy's question, I think that heat pump water heater and heat pump general adoption happens a lot better when folks are a little bit more familiar with the technology and kind of the steps that they need to take in order to integrate it within their home.
That's an excellent answer, Devin. Thank you for that. Dave says, oh, come on, these heat pump water heaters are really fun to discuss. We in this space sometimes spend a lot of our time on this, so some good advocates for heat pump water heaters here. I have one more question that I think any of you are welcome to answer before we close it for the top of the hour, and then we can stay on for a few minutes if anyone has additional questions. So I have heard pretty universally that the need for collaboration is really crucial to having effective heat pump programs, particularly incentives and rebates. So I was just wondering if any of you would like to elaborate on what some of the associated benefits and challenges and tactics for addressing collaboration are, that you guys talked about it a little bit briefly, but I think this is something really important to highlight and was hoping maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. So I'll open the floor. Would anyone like to start us off? Thank you, Maren.
Sure. Collaboration is really at the center of everything we do here in my Office of Resiliency. And I think one of the key things really is that consistency and developing those relationships. So we have regular monthly meetings with a variety of our partners across the state. So just keeping that up so that you're building that trust, because I actually think that is one of the challenges sometimes with with collaboration. Sometimes there's a hesitancy to fully engage in a partnership. Potentially there's concern about missing a word here. There's a hesitancy to engage potentially in case of like lack of attribution. That's the word I'm looking for. So for instance, I do know that we're still finding our way forward when it comes to stacking our Efficiency Arizona rebate program with some of the utilities or even some of the local communities. And that's not necessarily because of anybody's lack of trustworthiness, but there's a concern that maybe there might not be attribution when it comes to regulation or when it comes to the financial remuneration. And so we are making sure that we're having these constant communications, and we're really establishing the shared agreement, a shared understanding, and ensuring that we're addressing everybody's concerns. So yes, collaboration is important. It's also something that's actually can be difficult sometimes, which I think we don't necessarily always recognize how much effort. It just takes a lot of work too, just having those meetings and constantly having those communications and being transparent. But it's very much worth it.
Thank you, Maren. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I'll just say something brief. I mentioned the collaboration in Colorado with an organization called Belco, and I think it's been really helpful that we have like a bi-weekly meeting with the utility reps and some of the local governments and talk about aligning the trainings and the rebate requirements, and it's really helpful to have that kind of collaboration, because contractors around the state, they don't think about just I'm only going to serve this utility. They're thinking about serving the surrounding area, and they might have to work with several different utilities. So the more we can kind of align all the requirements and the rebates, that's really helpful to the contractors.
Great, thanks, Neil. I think we are to the top of the hour here, so I am going to thank everyone for joining. The recording will stop now, but we are happy to stick around and continue to ask a few questions. I have just a couple more that came in with registrations that we can work through if there's interest. Great. All right, so for some of these other questions that came in with the registration, Neil, I have one directed that I'm going to direct to you first. Do you have any sense of what percentage of existing homes in the region that you spoke about have central air conditioning?
Boy. I would just be guessing, but I think it's probably in around this area in Colorado, it's probably 60-70%. So I think it's a good number. You know, it's at my house, for example, the downstairs is pretty comfortable, except for like 1 or 2 days. And then I have a bedroom upstairs, and so I installed a mini split for that part to keep it cool, but the rest of the house doesn't need any air conditioning. So I don't know. A lot of houses, they have air conditioning and they're going to be more comfortable if they have it, but it's not as required as in Arizona for sure.
Thanks, Neil. I don't know, Maren, if you have any idea how many homes have central AC, but that is an interesting question. So.
I don't. I mean, I imagine in the Phoenix area, it's the majority of at least of new builds will have all of new builds will have it, but I couldn't tell you at a statewide level.
So our next question is about ducted versus ductless heat pumps. How does their cost and performance compare? And anybody, this is open to anyone who might want to respond. I see you're off mute, Neil.
Okay. Well, I'll say something. Well, for cost, first of all, if you already have a ducted system in your home, like if you have an existing air conditioner, for example, then it's going to be cheaper to go with a heat pump that's ducted to take advantage of the ducts. For a new home, there's ways to use either ductless or some combination of ducted and ductless, and I think that most people would say the cost of serving a whole home with a ductless system even for a new home is probably a little bit higher than a full ducted system. And then in terms of the question about performance, yeah, usually people say the ductless ones can be a little higher efficiency, and partly it's because you don't have to. There's all those losses associated with the ducts, and also the equipment itself. The ductless systems tend to be a little higher efficiency. So I hope that's helpful. Broad strokes.
I think that covers it. That's helpful. Thank you, Neil. So for Devin, or for anyone who would like to answer this one, is there an effort to reach homes heating with wood stoves with the goal of heat pumps as the main heat and wood stoves as a backup?
In the city of Missoula, we have some pretty bad air stagnation. So unless houses are grandfathered in, haven't been sold, and forget the date, we stopped allowing wood stoves. So I can't really speak to that on the city level. We have very few wood heated homes, with the exception of some pellet stoves. But I think on the county level, yeah, I think that's certainly a priority. One example of that is the Missoula County recently was awarded an EPA grant, and in that they developed what they're terming the Home Upgrade Hub, and it's going to both provide some electrification and efficiency materials for homes, but really what it's going to do is support about 20 or so whole home retrofits in efficiency. And in that criteria, they're going to really try to target homes that are heating currently with really either emissions intensive, air quality impact intensive, or costly methods. So in that, wood burning stoves is certainly one of their priorities there. But in city limits, it's not something we run into much.
Can I say something about that one? I was at a event recently and somebody did a great presentation about some work that they were doing with, I think it might have been in Arizona with some of the Native American communities, and they showed some cool examples of giving them a more efficient wood stove, like wood pellets, but cleaner, more efficient wood stove if they were replacing a very old inefficient one. And then if the funding allowed, also like a mini split to supplement that for the cooling. So that seems like a practical solution if the home is currently being heated with a wood stove, then that would be one way to go.
Great insight. Thank you both. So I think I have one more question, and I'll start. If Maren, if you want to take a stab at this, great. If not, anyone can answer. What is the compelling case for not allowing the market and not subsidies to decide winners and losers in home heating?
Well, that is a thesis in and of itself. I think that's just it's a whole other webinar series. When it comes to the way that we're rolling out ours, I think, let me just say, I think it's government's role to ensure that public health and safety is taken care of. And we have thousands of people in Arizona who are subject to extreme heat in their homes. And this is a way to ensure that they have a habitable building and that they are able to, continue with their lives. I think there's a lot more that could be said about that, but just from the perspective of our program, like I mentioned, this is a public health and safety issue. And this is a way that we're taking care of the most vulnerable communities in our state.
It's a great answer, and certainly another complex topic that we could spend quite a bit of time covering and still not touch all that there is to it. So I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for taking the time out of your day to speak with us about the incredible programs that you are running in your respective states and regions. You guys are doing some really important work, and it's encouraging to hear some of the success stories of what you guys have accomplished with your work. So I'm going to wrap up here. If anyone would like to make a final comment or add a closing thought, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to thank our attendees and close out here.